Japan that left, unlike the train in Japan that left the station something like 30 seconds early, we're starting a little less than that early. So I first got interested in John Forbes Nash probably about the same time everybody else did, when The Beautiful Mind movie appeared. And I think I saw the movie first, and then I've got the book by Sylvia Nasser, and then found some other resources, documentary and an interview on 60 Minutes. And then I presented, probably now a dozen years ago, about Nash at a number of meetings locally and nationally. And this section of my book, I've presented some other material from, is called Families in the Public Eye, and I finally finished that section. There's 2 chapters to go for the rest of the book. And finished, this was the 4th case study in that section on families in the public eye. It's long, but I hope to be able to get it in about an hour. So I'll just introduce it by saying that Bowen theory conceptualizes schizophrenia, which Nash was diagnosed as having, from 2 vantage points. In terms of the symptomatic individual, Bowen theory considers it an emotional dysfunction. And if you look at the family, Bowen theory considers it an emotionally driven disorder of the family relationship system. Reasoning is shattered, so to speak, in schizophrenia, and that was a quote from Emil Kraepelin way back, who first defined dementia praecox, and that name eventually changed over to schizophrenia. But in reading and writing this case up again, even though reasoning is shattered, Bowen theory considers the sustained and high level of emotional reactivity to be the driving or disruptive force for those symptoms. That's why it's called an emotional dysfunction. And I think importantly, a person vulnerable to psychosis like John Nash was, is he has the same emotions everybody else has in this world. But lacking a well-developed self and the ability to regulate or modulate periods of heightened reactivity is impaired. And of course, the sensitivity to the environment is very high as well, particularly the social environment. The lack of self, I often go back to something Bowen wrote in his early papers, saying that the people he studied there at NIMH who had that diagnosis had very prominent infantile yearnings. One is to be taken care of, figuratively, I would say nursed. 2 is to be free of responsibility. And 3 is to have an all-loving, all-giving, non-demanding figure at his or her side. So these yearnings, if unbridled, as they tend to be in the more hardcore schizophrenia, they interfere with having a productive life direction. So viewing people who are vulnerable to psychosis as having the same emotions everyone has can contribute to reducing the stigma of mental illness, perhaps, over time. So what I've done is relied heavily on Sylvia Nasser's book, which I consider well-researched and very thorough. And what I've done is culled out details from the book that illustrate how Bowen theory would explain the context of Nash's descent into and recovery from schizophrenia. So again, one of the things why I picked Nash to write up is to illustrate, I think, that Bowen theory regards schizophrenia as a functional dysfunction, a disorder of brain functioning, as opposed to a disorder of brain structure. And schizophrenia, along with most other clinical conditions, the social context is maybe the most important area to assess. Now I'm going to go first and talk about the family diagram very briefly. Here is John Nash, born in 1928. Most of you know he and his wife were killed in an auto accident in 2015. John Nash is the older of two siblings, has a sister, Martha, 3 years younger. Grew up in West Virginia, and his dad is an electrical engineer from Texas, moved to West Virginia as part of his work. His mother's family moved from North Carolina up to West Virginia around the turn of the century. And you can see here maybe that she's an oldest daughter of a rather big family, number 2 out of 8. And they married in 1924. John was born 4 years later. Then down, as we go to this part of the diagram, I've symbolized a lot of the people who were important in understanding this history. This is a man named Kerr with whom Nash had a sexualized, romanticized affair, basically, for over 5 years. And these squares indicate these were other relationships with males that he had. And this is when he was in his 20s. Then he met Eleanor Steer, and he never did marry Eleanor, but had a son by her. And that relationship lasted about 5 years. And I'll talk more about that later. And then, while still involved with Kerr and Eleanor, he meets Alicia, who was from El Salvador and a student at MIT. And they get involved in the end of 1956 and marry in February 1957. And one son from that marriage, which is key to the story, was born in 1959. They divorced in May of '63 and then remarried in 2001. Alicia is from what's called an aristocratic family in San Salvador, the city that she grew up in. Her dad was a physician, married for the first time, had a son who came to live with him and his second wife when they married. And their 2 children by that marriage, an older brother and Alicia. The older brother was institutionalized permanently, and I haven't found the information to explain the reason for that. Okay, that's just a quick overview of the family diagram. And now I decided to try to represent this graphically right at the outset to convey as best I can what I'm trying to get across in this presentation, regardless of who thinks it's accurate or not. So I've shown this, I made this graph. It goes from 1928 up past 1998. So that's spanning, what, 70 years or so. And on this axis is the estimated level of chronic anxiety. This is the level I estimated as existing in John, but again, it's the context that creates the chronic anxiety, and usually one or more people, but in this case, one person in particular absorbed that chronic anxiety and carried it, and that would be the fuel for his symptoms. So the diagram symbolizes Nash's birth. I'll talk about what he was like as a young boy and teenager. But I would put the level of chronic anxiety about here, in my estimate, until he left for college in 1945, went up to Pittsburgh to Carnegie Institute of Technology. So I show a spike in chronic anxiety when he left home. That continued through the period. He went then from Carnegie Tech to Princeton to get his PhD in mathematics. And this spike in anxiety begins with him marrying Alicia. And I'll come back to what some of the evidence for chronic anxiety increasing at that point in time. But still, this is a period all the way up through most of 1958, almost 30 years, in which he was not psychotic, no psychotic symptoms, but a lot of chronic anxiety. And then the big spike comes with her getting pregnant. And over the next several months, the symptoms of psychosis turn up in John, and they last for a period of about 10 years in a pretty florid state. And then by a number of observers, beginning in about 1970, the symptoms gradually began to decrease. And by 1990 or so, he was pretty much considered symptom-free. Occasional voice or delusional type thought, but nothing that interfered with his functioning. And he wound up with doing a 20-year career back at Princeton on the mathematics faculty. So that's what I'm trying to get at, that the chronic anxiety is spiking and increasing and being sustained corresponds with the psychotic symptoms, and then trying to then show the social context and how it changed, particularly the family social context, and how that seemed to play a role in the symptoms diminishing. Okay, this is in writing, I sort of apologize in the book for putting in so much detail about prior to the onset of his schizophrenia. I including a fair amount of detail. And I do that because I think it indicates that this is a man whose level of self was not very well developed. And I'll explain how I assess that. And then a lot of details about the period of florid psychosis. And to a significant extent, I go into that because Nash has got some great insights into the nature of psychosis and how a psychosis can function to preserve homeostasis in an individual even though on the surface it's pretty crazy. Going back to his early years, he was a healthy baby, but here's some of the terms that were used to describe him: solitary, introverted as a little boy, bookish, socially awkward, a dreamer. He learned to read by the time he was 4, thanks to his mother's efforts and his talents. He liked to perform for peers, but never formed close companionships with his peers. He did not date anyone through high school, and his parents were constantly trying to get him more socialized, and he resisted that. He was an outstanding problem solver, and a lot of arrogance went with that. And during this whole period of growing up through his teens, before he left for Carnegie Tech, Virginia, his mother, would frequently try to get Sister Martha to take John with her on social functions that she did, and that just shows the intensity behind this focus on getting John socialized. That triangle between Virginia and Martha and John, very intense, and had a big impact in Martha's life, but she clearly is the more functional of the two. The father, available to John in a lot of ways, but definitely the outsider in the triangle involving his wife and John. And Nasser notes that during this period in his life, at Carnegie Tech and at Princeton, and he appeared as if he felt nothing regarding love and friendship or sympathy for others. He lived in his head, and his primary pleasure in life came from creative work rather than emotional closeness with others. I thought that was an interesting description of the backdrop on him. He pursued males at Carnegie Tech, and then he pursued males when he got to Princeton in 1948 to Princeton. These relationships with males tended to be intense, but unstable and short-lived. He would pursue them so vigorously. And with all his anxious efforts to connect with males and the anxieties associated with social interaction, when he was involved in mathematics, he was a much more functional human being, a lot surer of himself. And after he finished his PhD, he went to MIT and to work at the RAND, and in the summers worked at the RAND Corporation. MIT would let him go out to California. And he was actually arrested for soliciting sex from a man in a restroom there in Santa Monica near the RAND institution building. Lost his security clearance, got fired, and he never told his family anything about this. Interestingly, he did not regard himself as a homosexual. He met Eleanor Steer in 1952. This is after he had moved up to Boston. She was a nurse in a hospital where he had had some minor surgery. And he also met Bricker, who was a graduate student at MIT. About the same time, he started these two relationships. And the Bricker relationship, Nasser observed that it sort of woke Nash up to what a powerful emotional relationship feels like, and the power of the forces that bind people together. He had been seemingly fairly oblivious to that prior. But he began to realize that certain relationships, like with Bricker, more so than Eleanor, and these relationships were going on at the same time. Without these relationships, he would just feel adrift and lost in the world. I would say that the relationship between John and Eleanor was a clear, in many ways, a clear replication of the emotional fusion with his mother. He enforced a certain emotional distance with Eleanor. She had a soft heart to the point of giving coats to strangers and was extremely protective of John. She lacked self-confidence, and John would be highly critical of her, frequently putting her down. Nasser beautifully described the reciprocity in their relationship as John being egocentric and childish, and Eleanor being self-abnegating and maternal, feeding back and forth on each other. Even though John had this intense and sexual relationship and eventually a child by Eleanor, he never told his family about Eleanor. He never told his family about the child. He never introduced Eleanor to fellow faculty at MIT. Their relationship was not great before the child was born, and it deteriorated even further after John David Steer was the name he got, because John refused to put his name on the birth certificate. He refused to provide any financial help. It culminated in Elizabeth having to go to a home for unwed mothers to finish out her pregnancy, and it also resulted in the baby being in foster care for almost over 5 years. At one point, when their son was about 2 or 3, John was continuing to pressure her to adopt the baby out, but Eleanor didn't want to do that. And she continued to make excuses for John and hope for the best. And a lot of emphasis on her and other people being dazzled by his brilliance. It's interesting in the relationship between Bricker and John and Eleanor, it's very similar. I should put dashed lines around them both, but that the Eleanor and Bricker were the ones eclipsed in the relationship. John seemed to have the upper hand. He was also very jealous of Bricker and very critical of Bricker, like he was with Elizabeth. Probably more jealous with Bricker, though, than with Elizabeth. Eleanor, excuse me. And then Bricker eventually flunked out of MIT and ended that relationship with Nash. It was interesting that Nasser observed, and I would echo this, that when, as I'll show shortly, when his wife, Alicia, had a baby, I'm implicating the pregnancy as a very important event in fostering his development of psychotic symptoms. Why not with Eleanor? And she suggests that that by not choosing either relationship, he was sort of with Bricker, with Eleanor, minimized the dependence that they had on him and that he had on them. So it kind of insulated him from a strong reaction to the pregnancy. It's tempting to blame Nash. He seems so selfish and so self-centered and so inconsiderate of others, all of which are descriptively accurate. But the rich detail provided shows that Eleanor and Bricker both reciprocally reinforced those immaturities in John. He met his wife, Devi, in 1956. He was still involved with Bricker and Eleanor at that point. her parents had moved to the United States some years earlier, and Alicia's mother, who was a key player in this whole story, when Alicia was accepted at MIT, Alicia's mother came to Boston with her daughter, and her father, a doctor who had worked there, stayed in New York. Alicia fell into the same sort of hero worshiping of Nash that Eleanor and Bricker did. She was intelligent and determined woman herself, and she chased after him initially, and they started dating within a few months after they met, before the year was out. That was in 1957. And again, he did not treat Alicia well. He launched into being the critical partner routine with her. He never paid for meals that they had out together. They consummated the relationship within a few months. Both Bricker and Eleanor were still in Nash's life at that point. Just again, I present this to show the chaos of sorts that existed and the lack of self that would be involved in that. Well, then Eleanor discovered that Nash and Alicia were involved. And of course, and she went to Alicia and accused her of trying to steal her man and said, "Do you know that he had a son by me?" And of course, she didn't. And then she also contacted John's parents back in Bluefield. And the father reacted by saying, "John, you got to marry that woman." The mother said, "Yes, you got to marry that woman. I so want you to have a normal life, John." Possibly related, John's father's health deteriorated after that during 1956, and he died of a massive heart attack in September of that year. Virginia was furious at her son, but she blamed Eleanor for causing her husband's heart attack and death by revealing what was going on with John. He married Alicia in February 1957. They first lived in New York City. John was on leave from MIT and down at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Alicia was working and helping to pay the rent, and they socialized as a couple a fair amount, but more distance existed in their relationship than Alicia wanted. Meanwhile, there were some signs that John was becoming more obsessed than usual with his math projects during that first year of their marriage. And it's likely that the level of chronic anxiety in the marital relationship was increasing, which I showed on the graph, and was driving some of his obsessing. Alicia remained totally dedicated and supportive of John. And so the marriage was off to a decent start despite the tensions and the distance. Professionally, John experienced some disappointment during that year and not getting certain recognitions that he sought. He had not yet been given any tenure at MIT. And like Princeton, it was related to difficult relationships with some of the other faculty members. So then after the year at the Institute in Princeton, back to MIT, and then for those of you who remember seeing the movie, he became absorbed with the Riemann hypothesis during that summer, which some in the field consider the most important unresolved problem in mathematics. And he was determined, really obsessed with solving it. He was also worrying about finances, and the man could be very hard on himself when things were not going well. Some have speculated that obsession with solving the Riemann hypothesis, which put him so much into his head and created such seemingly internal tension, may have contributed to the mental breakdown that came to fruition toward the end of that year in 1958 and in the first months of 59. Nash thought that may have been part of his problem, being so obsessed with trying to solve that hypothesis, which he never did. But again, Bowen theory would suggest there are more important relationships were at work. In late July of '58, John and Alicia traveled to Europe, and that's when Alicia discovered she was pregnant. Got pregnant in Europe. And when they came back from Europe, they settled back in Cambridge now, and John returned to his duties at MIT. He met a male graduate student at MIT and began pursuing him as he had done with Bricker and others before his marriage. Alicia sensed there was something going on there. She was also herself feeling ambivalent about the pregnancy, dispirited, anxious, and alone. She had hoped that the pregnancy would bring her and John closer together, but it did not happen. John grew even more cold and distant. Her emotional struggles deepened between returning from Europe in September and up through Thanksgiving. And I show that in the graph. Anxiety increasing during 1958, but still not enough to generate florid psychotic symptoms in John until the end of 1958. By Thanksgiving, though, Alicia was becoming so alarmed with troubling changes she saw in John that she sort of put her own troubles aside and began to focus more intensely on him. She was fearing that John was having an affair, and John accused her of the same thing. So things were a bit unraveling. Alicia wondered if it was the responsibility of the new baby, or was it the responsibility that was stressing John, or the state of their marriage, or just worries about his professional career. And then New Year's Eve that year, December '58, was kind of a nodal point because they went to, a colleague had a New Year's Eve party, costume party, and John turns up in a diaper with a milk bottle, baby bottle of milk, and spends the evening in Alicia's lap, sucking milk from the milk bottle. Everybody considered it a bit strange. In the early months of '59, Alicia tried to shield John's growing instability from MIT colleagues. She feared his career would be jeopardized. She got a job on campus so she could watch John much of the time, and often she would pick him up at the end of the workday so he wouldn't get into trouble, and to take him out to eat. And they used to invite people to go with them. She stopped inviting people. But the faculty at MIT were aware, and John still got his tenure there at the end of January '59. But the department relieved him of all teaching responsibility in the hope of reducing his stress level. Then John decides to impulsively drive to Washington, D.C. He wants to deliver letters to the embassies there. He wanted to tell various foreign dignitaries about his mission to form and head up a world government. And he was convinced military leaders around the globe were conspiring to take over the world and needed to be stopped. And that was his mission. So clearly delusional at that point. And Alicia went with him on that trip, mostly for fear he would get into more trouble if she didn't. When they get back to Boston, she makes an appointment with a psychiatrist at MIT to discuss John, and he recommends psychiatric hospitalization, also speculating John might need electroshock therapy. Alicia was very afraid that shock therapy or even medications could damage this wonderful brain he had. She asked Virginia and her daughter Martha if they would come to Boston to help implement the plan of putting John in the hospital. They committed him to McLean Hospital, pretty well-known institution up there right outside of Boston. And that would be early April of '59 that he was hospitalized. He told the admitting doctors he was the Prince of Peace, leader of a great movement for world peace. He did not think he needed to be hospitalized and was fiercely angry at Alicia for doing it. He threatened to divorce her. Virginia was devastated when she visited John in McLean, but he seemed pretty normal in many ways to some of his colleagues when they came to see him, and a lot of them did. Diagnosed there, paranoid schizophrenia, speculated that it might have been triggered by fetus envy or latent homosexuality. And these, some of you may remember, were popular ideas in psychiatry at the time. His psychosis did disappear in a matter of few weeks there at McLean, and he became a model patient on the ward. He told the doctors he was aware that he had been delusional. He continued to threaten Alicia with divorce, and he stayed there 50 days and then was discharged, and that came a week after his son was born. Alicia stayed fairly cool in face of John's continued threats of divorce. He even threatened to hurt her and to take all their money and go to Europe, but she kept her cool. So based on the information I've presented, I assess the Nash relationship to have generated some chronic anxiety during courtship in the first 18 months of their marriage. Dr. Nash seemed to become somewhat more obsessed with his math projects, which can be a form of emotional distancing. Alicia was getting distraught by the distance she experienced between them, but this level of anxiety in the first part of '58 didn't seem to be enough to trigger florid psychotic symptoms in John. But then there was a palpable spike in chronic anxiety after Alicia got pregnant. And I have a section in here, I'm not going to go through here, but where I had taken up individuality, togetherness, balance in previous chapter in the book, and a section about that as a way Bowen theory would look at, and I'll offer a diagram a little later about that. There are two ways that spike of anxiety after the pregnancy. One would be his interest in a third person, a man, and in Alicia feeling isolated and overwhelmed. The comfortable balance in their relationship was significantly disturbed prior to the pregnancy. It seems unquestionable. So each spouse changed, and each spouse changed as they did. The relationship changed in reciprocal fashion. This is the reciprocity we talk about in the theory, and eventually reached a point where it was high enough to disturb Nash's functioning to the point of psychotic processes appearing. Over the course of their relationship, Alicia clearly became the more dominant partner. Nash's dependence on the significant female in his life became increasingly evident. As I wrote this, and I think back in my brother's situation, which I had presented earlier in the week, and his suicide, when the relationship between him and my mother he perceived as very threatened. I mean, how are people to grasp that this can be so powerful that it could trigger a psychotic period? And I found a paper by Jaak Panksepp, published in 2010, and I saw there that he had renamed his panic system the panic grief system. And he theorized that panic grief, along with this overactivity of the panic grief section, which is anchored subcortically in the brain, and the seeking network, underactivity, underarousal, the seeking network, which involves seeking behavior versus withdrawal, and calls these ancestral tools for living. And he suggests that they may play a key role in outcomes such as suicide and psychosis. It needs to be brought into psychiatry more. Instead of focusing so much on brain defects, to think about overactive emotional systems. And I would see suicide and psychosis as two different ways of reacting to a major threat to survival. So given the powerful human need for emotional closeness, a real or imagined threat to a relationship on which a person is extremely dependent constitutes a threat to survival. And I kind of emphasize this in the writing because people are going to say, she's just pregnant, for gosh sakes, he'll get over it. How could you theorize that it could create this much threat and generate enough anxiety that you would say it triggered psychosis? And you can't prove that. But I did decide to put up in the book a diagram at that point, just to re-emphasize what I was saying. This would represent the courtship and early parts of their relationship, a rather large emotional investment in each other that was working, a certain amount of emotional distance that was part of that, and some chronic anxiety in each person, but the relationship being in relative balance. Then comes the pregnancy, and I show her emotional investment as being reduced, his continuing to be the same, and suggesting that the investment in the baby is key. And many mothers will describe that they were unsure if they could meet the needs of both their spouse and the baby, and will find themselves often given priority to the baby. So I think there is a reality here about that, but there's also John's sensitivity to the degree of attachment that's forthcoming and his reactivity to maybe imagined threats. So that would escalate his anxiety related to that changing context by the addition of the third person. Another thing would be just the whole built-in set of expectations the spouse has and the situation has of the husband in the period of pregnancy, and that can be a source of chronic anxiety. So I see both of those dynamics as being important to understand. So the fact of, and I talked earlier about Eleanor's pregnancy did not trigger psychosis, but I think it may have very well been related to John was not fully committed and didn't have the same kind of emotional dependence thanks to his dealing with Bricker and Eleanor at the same time, perhaps. It was a different context. John remained hugely angry at Alicia even after he got out of the hospital. He was able to get back to work at MIT. Virginia came up, his mother, to help with the baby, but she acted as if she needed to protect the baby from John, fearful of what he might do. John thought his colleagues at MIT had colluded in the hospitalization, which to some extent was true, and he abruptly resigned then from MIT in 1959. And withdrew all his pension money, and then was already thinking about going back to Europe fairly quickly after being released from McLean. It was pretty evident John really hadn't recovered there. His symptoms went way down in the hospital, but once he got out, it was back to where he had been. So in July '59, at his insistence, they sailed to Europe on the Queen Mary with Alicia coming along again to protect him. Alicia's mother took the baby back to Washington, where she and her husband were now living, and with a plan to bring the baby to Paris when they finally got settled over in Paris. John was still clearly delusional. He wanted to give up his passport, become a citizen of the world. He tried unsuccessfully to do it. Eventually, he destroyed the passport. And Alicia noted that John seemed to be trying to destroy all aspects of his previous identity. Made me think of that song about freedom's just another name for nothing left to lose, and that seemed to be characteristic of what was driving him. But he had this new mission that in many ways created a certain euphoria, kept him in high spirits in this early parts of being in Europe, showing how a delusional state can lift despair and bind anxiety in that sense. And John is good at describing that, how useful this state was given the state of his life at that point in time. It's better than suicide, you might say. I would. So the anxiety manifests in the delusion rather than driving a feeling of dread. He goes off to Switzerland. Alicia goes to Italy. They're apart for some weeks. They get tired of him in Switzerland for a number of reasons. They threaten to deport him. Alicia goes to Geneva, brings him home. And by then, Alicia's mother and the baby have come to Paris. Let's see, I must have skipped something there. Anyway, that she's in Paris, the baby's there. They go back. Alicia's mother goes back, but John and Alicia and the baby, Alicia works out a deal with the State Department, even though he no longer has a passport, and with the help of Alicia helping to pay for it, to bring John back to the U.S., because he didn't want to come, but they brought him back. And that was April 60. And John went to Princeton to live with Alicia, and their son went to Washington. Alicia and their son went to Washington with their parents, so they were split. You can get a flavor for the state of the relationship at that point. And they remained split for another few months, and finally, Alicia agreed to come back to Princeton. And they lived together in an apartment there. She tried to be as attentive to him as she could be. But Nash continued to not only act crazy, but to look crazy. His gaze was described as almost dazed, and he would walk barefoot around Princeton town. Meanwhile, the university cut him a lot of slack. Even though he was acting crazy, he didn't seem to be a threat to anybody. But as this wore on, Alicia got more depressed and started consulting a psychiatrist. He encouraged another commitment for John, this time to Trenton State Hospital. And then Virginia and Martha again helped. And he was committed there January 61 and was there for 6 months at Trenton State. And that's when he had the insulin coma therapy sessions, a lot of them. He hated it, but the doctors thought it was effective. He did improve in the hospital, even enough to work on a math paper. He was discharged in July of 61. He said, his comment was, "Giving up my delusions produced a sense of diminution and loss." He referred to it as enforced rationality. Again, the function of having a delusion, I think, needs to be appreciated. Now, there are other kinds of delusions that aren't so comfortable. He got a year's appointment to the Institute for Advanced Study again. He didn't see his son during all of 61. Alicia's mother finally brought their son back to Princeton. Alicia's father came as well, and now they're all living together. Alicia's parents, Alicia, John, and John Charles Martin Nash, their son. And the mother was taking care of Johnny, pretty much, the boy. John seemed to be doing, senior seemed to, the father, doing a little better, and could conduct himself pretty reasonably in one-on-one encounters with people he knew, and even had a sense of humor. And he agreed to seeing a psychiatrist during that time. But big changes were on the horizon. John returned to France, this time without Alicia, impulsively. By the last part of 61, their marriage was clearly on the rocks. And John appeared woefully diminished in response to the prospect of losing her, even though he could treat her in not very pleasant ways, despite being so angry. And then it was deteriorating, and he becomes even more angry and restless. And June of 62 again takes off to Europe, but his functioning, it's clear his functioning has not improved. He writes a letter to his sister saying, "I'm a man alone in a strange world." And that's a theme that's powerful in the whole story, emotional isolation. He came back to Princeton in the summer of 62, not any better. She decided to pursue a divorce. She began those proceedings at the end of 62, and it was final in May of 63. So now they're divorced. Meanwhile, the colleagues he has are seeing that this man needs treatment. They're raising money. Virginia, the mother, kicks in. They want to send him to Michigan somewhere, to an institution there for maybe as much as 2 years. His time at the Institute of Advanced Study, the relationships are deteriorating, but he resists going to Michigan. So then Virginia, Martha, and Alicia, the big three, get him an involuntary commitment to Carrier Clinic, which applied psychiatric services near Princeton. He was again adamant about not needing treatment, and he was also adamant about not having electroconvulsive therapy. But he was placed on a locked ward for 5 months, took antipsychotic drugs that were prescribed, and formed a relationship with a psychiatrist there that continued for the next 2 years in Princeton. His psychotic symptoms improved quickly in the hospital, as they commonly did. The Advanced Institute for Advanced Study gave him another job, sort of as a favor to try to help him. And he yearned for resolution with Alicia. And that hunger, as I say, was the defining characteristic of the entire 1960s for John. Needing Alicia in his life. But she was definitely not interested. John rented a room in Princeton, kept a low profile, but felt very lonely. Alicia did agree to go with him on some social functions, but that was not a great period really for either one of them, the mid-60s. She was having work issues. She was having a harder time dealing with her son and finding him difficult to manage. Her mother tried to help her by taking Johnny off her hands for a period of months and took him to El Salvador. And now Alicia was seeing a psychiatrist regularly for depression. Her husband began to seem somewhat improved, but wanting to be back with Alicia dominated his mindset, and that improvement did not last. He took another trip to Europe. Delusions and voices were strong, mood dismal. Back home in 64, psychotic symptoms declined again when they committed him yet again to Carrier Clinic. The antipsychotic drugs seemed to help the psychotic symptoms, but the emotional pain, that gets back to that panic grief system perhaps, was unresolved. Out of carrier in 65, the next phase of the Odyssey took him to Boston, where the math department at Brandeis gave him a position, deeply missing his wife and ex-wife and son, loneliness dominating. He didn't manage to produce some published articles at Brandeis, saw a psychiatrist weekly, took antipsychotic medications at a low dose at his request, saw Eleanor and his older son, John David, in the Boston area, visited with them fairly regularly, but there were a lot of tensions between the three of them. He couldn't stop criticizing that son, but he did offer to pay for college for his son, and that seemed to help him. None of that period in Boston diminished his desire to be reconciled with Alicia, but she wasn't even inclined to see him at that point. Most of his activities in Boston were solitary. Then he began to feel a little more confident as time went on in that first year at Brandeis, and his colleagues actually regarded him as fairly sane. He came across as less arrogant, less aloof, but it didn't last. He began writing clearly delusional letters to Martha and was clearly paranoid by late 66, meandering aimlessly around Harvard Square like he had done at Princeton. After a few impulsive sojourns around the country, he went to Roanoke and then lived with his mother in her apartment for over a year. His sister and family lived nearby. He feared that Virginia and Martha and Alicia would again try to hospitalize him. The relationship with his mother deteriorated, and she died in November 69. John worried he had hastened her demise. After her death, John attempted to live with Martha and her family, but she couldn't cope with that. And she decided to get John committed yet again to a hospital in Stanton, Virginia. This was after Christmas in 1969. He was hospitalized into February of 1970. Furious with Martha for doing this, he broke off his relationship with Martha for years after that. Alicia had no role in this hospitalization. She had given up on the value of committing him anywhere. It just wasn't worth it. So Stanton turned out to be John's last contact with hospitals. This is 1970. No hospital contact, no medication, and no other form of therapy for the rest of his life. After leaving the hospital, he goes to Princeton, and he later described his delusions as a desperate attempts to make sense out of chaos. He continued his old antics on the Princeton campus, but a very important development of the story occurred with Alicia. Alicia worried about John further deteriorating and becoming homeless and even dying. And so she invited John to live indefinitely as a boarder in her home. No relationship of any romantic nature, just as a boarder. Living with her and their son would prove to have a powerful impact on reducing his level of agitation. So transparent about that. The drop in chronic anxiety in the early 70s I noted on the diagram. It is interesting that the agitation improved, but the irrational thinking was slower to disappear. But this was the beginning of the gradual decrease in psychotic symptoms. Just the power of that relationship with Alicia. Princeton was like a therapeutic community to him. They tolerated a lot, and that helped. They wanted to preserve that beautiful mind. Alicia supported John fully, expected almost nothing in return. While he was still delusional, he was able to moderate his behavior, and that kept him out of hospitals and away from psychiatrists. He was diffident, shy, and gentle at this point. What he needed, he said, was safety, freedom, and friendship. Alicia credited her own post-divorce experience with depression as helping her be more understanding of John's plight. She endured a long period of work problems herself. John wasn't bringing in any money. She relied on welfare and food stamps for a period to get enough food and for the three of them. It forced her eventually to sell the house they had in Princeton and move up to nearby Princeton Junction into a less expensive house. And John moved with them. But another important development was that Johnny was becoming increasingly unhappy, the son, as he moved into his teenage years. As his problems increased, John became increasingly important in helping with the parenting. He was the bad cop and Alicia was the softie. Fiercely protective of her son, she often defended him to her husband. She was the family leader. John did nothing without first consulting her. During '73, things began to look a little brighter for Alicia. She got a good job as a programmer, but it involved long commutes. John's mother had left him some money, and he contributed that to Johnny attending a nearby private prep school. Johnny had been getting difficult and moody at home, but was an excellent student and had a talent for mathematics. However, his problems began to get worse. And by the time he was 17, it was he who was in the Carrier clinic and being diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic. And his delusions were different. He studied the Bible obsessively, talked damnation and redemption, also hearing voices. And he fought treatment attempts even more vigorously than his dad. He ran away frequently. And again, he was diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic at Carrier, and he would not return to school again for 3 years until he was 20. Like her husband's mother, her son, Alicia, that was her private sorrow, a situation she tried to hide from other people. But despite lacking a high school and college degree, with the help of a math professor at Rider College, Johnny got admitted to the math program at Rutgers and managed to get a PhD in mathematics in 1985. Interestingly, despite his success, Johnny had been ambivalent about the studies, arguing that he did not understand why he had to do anything. After all, his father did not do anything and his mother was supporting him. Why not me? Finishing his degree made things look hopeful for Johnny and the family. Johnny got an instructorship at Marshall University and Alicia got a good job in Newark. John's functioning continued to improve here in the mid to later 80s. And so did his psychosis, markedly improved. He still had some paranoid thoughts and heard voices, but the noise level was turned way down. He could recognize the paranoid ideas and reject them intellectually, he explained. Johnny, however, was a different story. His year at Marshall was a disaster. He returned home and never left. He did not work and was hospitalized many times. He refused to take medication outside the hospital. Drugs could keep him out of the hospital, but they could not give him a life. The point again emphasizes an underlying lack of self as the core problem. Johnny gave up many of his past activities, such as playing chess and reading. He could get quite angry and violent at times, terrorizing John and Alicia. Much of John's life, John Sr. or Jr., his father's life energy was now focused on his son and helping his son. So Johnny, I would say, had the infantile yearnings even at a more powerful level than his father did. I mean, he acted them out fully. But it was a very anxious scene. The family would go for family therapy every Friday night to try to head things off, but it didn't help much. John had meanwhile, as I said, returned to Princeton to work, and did that until he died in 2015. And so that's the situation that prevailed until they died. So I just show this multi-generational diagram. My thesis would be, I'm simplifying this, but the fusion between Virginia and John was this intense. I think it was slightly less intense than the unresolved attachment. And Alicia had to have less data, but also a strong fusion with her own mother. That these had equal levels of self. But then the fusion with Johnny was even more powerful, with the parents over-functioning and Johnny under-functioning. So interestingly, I'll just end this story with, there was an article printed a couple of years ago. Somebody had gone to interview Johnny and see how he was doing after his parents' deaths. He had been not hospitalized again since they died, and he's functioned better than most people who knew him and knew the family anticipated. The voices and visual hallucinations that he had since a teenager have faded away. Again, no psychiatric hospitalizations, and he's continued to live in the house they all lived in, where he's lived in 45 of his 58 years. He resumed playing chess. He has a treatment team that's very helpful to him, even in social activities. He does take the psychoactive medications. So from the perspective of Bowen theory, Johnny's chronic anxiety has decreased since his parents' deaths. His improvement is reminiscent of my schizophrenic brother's significant improvements when our parents became dysfunctional. Much of the chronic anxiety that fueled Johnny's long symptomatic period appears to have been generated in the parental triangle, with his parents anxiously focusing on him and over-functioning, and Johnny playing the opposite or dysfunctional side. His improvement represents an increase in functional level. So John and Alicia then remarried in 2001. They've been talking about it for a few years. And he, again, had worked at Princeton for the next 20 years until he was killed. And he also got back in contact with his other son and with his sister and some old colleagues. He got the Nobel in 1994 and another prize in 2015 in Norway, a math prize. But then that's on that trip back from Norway is when they were killed. So I decided to conclude the chapter with one more diagram, just to punch up what I'm proposing happened here. This would be the pre-pregnancy situation, neither one with a lot of self, but a balanced emotional investment in each other, each receiving enough attention and acceptance and not with realistic expectations of each other to keep it in balance. Then comes the disruption with the pregnancy. I call this the wilderness years. I borrowed that from Winston Churchill. Churchill had a decade of being out of favor and pretty tough time. And this, for John Nash, I would call his wilderness years of primarily characterized by loneliness and yearning for reconciliation and continuing chronic anxiety, presumably being the fuel for the psychosis. And then the return, Alicia taking him in, them eventually recovering a romantic relationship, but also the potency of the triangle with their son as they overfunction in relationship to him. That had to, and if you saw, Mike Wallace did an interview with Alicia and Johnny and John at their home in Princeton Junction. And you could just see the father hawking over the son and the son bristling at that. And the mother kind of sitting quietly there by, but definitely very involved. Okay, I'm sorry it took so long. I apologize in my book for that. And But I hope hearing the whole story may have conveyed something worthwhile. And so let's shift now to any comments or questions.
People would turn on their video, please, and type into the chat room for questions or comments.
Guess that didn't work. Yeah, drink of water here. I mean, basically what I'm taking on here is the medical model that there's a pathology in the brain, used to be thought of as psychological and now more as biological, that drives the process. It doesn't ignore the role of stress completely by any means, but stress factors were more popular in the psychoanalytic days, but still out there people realize that stress is involved, but still the model is some kind of a defect, and that's what's driving this condition, and it's supposed to deteriorate over time instead of get better. Okay, we'll go to Vancouver, and my usual leadoff hitter, Randy, go ahead.
Mike, I was wondering about the borrowing and trading of self in the marriage between Alicia and John. And I understood you to say early in the relationship that he was sort of dominant and she was more adaptive. And then at some point that began to shift and she became the dominant one and him the more adaptive one, presumably losing self in that. And of course, when the pregnancy came along, that further disrupted the previous balance in the relationship. But I was just wondering when that shift began to occur from him being the more dominant to her being the more dominant of the two.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure about that, and that's why I think I said that, wrote that over time it was increasingly evident that she was the dominant partner, and it spells out that he, when they were three of them living together again, pretty much he checked out everything he did with her, and but what it was like in that first year or so, I mean, she became seemingly the more symptomatic person after the pregnancy, but at the same time, he was developing a lot of problems that weren't fully shown at that point. But so in the beginning, I mean, he would keep people at a distance. He would be critical to them, not treat them well. It's hard to call that dominance exactly, but she was always described as determined and knew what was important to her. And so it's just that it seemed pretty clear as things developed over time that not only did she overfunction in relationship to him with his psychosis, but even later as he started to improve, she was definitely the family leader. What's behind your question? I don't have any more to say about it, I don't think. What would you say? What prompts your question?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the gaining and losing self in the relationship. And when it was balanced, as you described it, in terms of investment, it seemed like he was more dominant, calling the shots, and she was going along with it. And then at some point that began to shift. And I just wondered to what extent that also played a part as he was losing pseudo-self in the relationship with her, that also contributed to his vulnerability to the symptoms he developed.
Yeah, I really don't know what to say there. I just, the piece that was really clear was his sense of losing her, and her loss of investment in him. That definitely was dominating, and the whole experience reduced him. All the bravado disappeared, and he became a fairly likable fellow, from what I understand, and not arrogant so much anymore, and much more low key. But I don't know quite how to say that. I mean, I don't know how you would conceptualize the losing self, except in the process of giving her a baby. You know, he in a sense lost something very important to him. At least that was his perception of it. And I think, I remember seeing a family in my cancer study way back, that the husband developed a cancer of the stomach at age 29 while his wife was pregnant. And the wife was pretty savvy. She says, you know, my husband has been hurting ever since this pregnancy became known. And she says, I have to admit that I am putting far more emotional investment in my baby, and I can't seem to feel and provide the same thing for him that I used to. Now, she came right out and said that. Now, Alicia, definitely, even when the baby was born, she remained very much involved in trying to save him. And but so it just made me think, I mean, what is the depth of this, and how well do I understand it? Because I think the pregnancy and immature relationships, you know, can surface in a husband killing a child, a wife killing a child, a husband killing a wife. I mean, it's just, I'm in awe of the power of this thing, and I don't think I fully understand it by a long shot. Why? Like, as I think about it with my brother's suicide, it's hard to imagine the emotional pain, and I like that panic grief idea of Panksepp's, that would drive a suicide, and or in this case, drive a psychotic state. It's almost beyond my comprehension, yet factually it seems to happen over and over and over in these circumstances. But thanks for your question. I'm sorry I couldn't do a better job on it. Okay, out to San Diego, where I just spent a little time recently.
Okay.
Right there.
Okay. All right, here I am.
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay. I usually have a question too, and actually my question in some ways relates to Randy's question. I've been thinking a lot about the concept of self and what that actually means. And one of the things that I've come up with is a sense of self-efficacy, meaning a belief in one's own wholeness that doesn't require an emotional dependency for functioning, that one with a sense of self-efficacy doesn't have to derive or gain resources from the other members of the family, in that they're more self-regulating, they're better self-regulating, they're more self-contained. And I'm wondering what the evolution then is of the development of that sense of self-efficacy. is there in the parent-child dyad, in the reciprocity of that relationship, like with Martha and with John Sr., was there Martha gaining a sense of efficacy in her role as mother to the young John? Is it that sense of self-efficacy that we're talking about when we talk about sense of self? And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the principal thing I would say, it's my view of the concept of self in Bowen theory. I think the most observable quality of it is not the sense of self, because that requires some speculation about what's going on, but how the person actually functions in relationships and how adaptive they are or are not to adverse contexts arising in their relationship. And I would see John, clearly his lack of self surfaced in his inability to adapt effectively to this change in social context that for most people is negotiable. But at his level of differentiation, which I'd put him at the low part of the moderate range, not down in the 20% at the lowest range, but probably just above at the lowest levels of the moderate range, where his son, I would see, is more impaired than that. I mean, the son remaining clearly dependent for his whole life, and really never pursued anything that was very constructive, and they played into it. But how people then describe it, I mean, ways I've talked about it in the past is, I mean, if a person feels an adequate control of their situation, which would, get into the realm of self-efficacy, I guess, you have some kind of confidence that you can manage what's going to come down the road. I mean, that certainly can be part of what a self is like. And so, I don't know, there are a lot of words that could be used to maybe describe certain aspects. I just don't think it's a sense of self. It really is self. It's the ability to maintain a self that's observable, and how that plays out in the individual seems to be that a person does have that confidence that whatever comes along, they can deal with it. If you want to call that self-efficacy, okay. But my main point would be sense of self, I think, moves it back into more of an individual framework. You may not agree with that, but that's a thought I have. You want to say any more?
I'm really glad I asked you that question, because I had never heard you say that before. And I think it makes a lot of sense when you're talking about self versus sense of self, because then you're looking at facts of functioning. And I guess you could say that if one is able to function for self and is not reliant upon the resources and energies of others in order to sort of maintain their own survival, and then you would be able to just look at their actual functioning in order to determine that level of self, rather than having to sort of get at what they might have been thinking or believing about themselves. And so I think that helps me think more systemically about it. So thank you.
Yeah, I remember, I may not remember all the details well enough, but at the NIMH Family Study Project, Bowen has a description of father, mother, schizophrenic daughter very demanding and clutching to the mother caving in a lot, the father sort of getting lost in the anxiety contained in that interaction and being stuck in the triangle, and then able to be around that mother and daughter and somehow lift himself up out of that and communicate that effectively to his wife. In essence, I'm not going to support all this treating her as if she can't manage. I'm just not going to go along with that anymore. And I thought that was, like you just said, that's a functional fact. He was able to stand up to that, whereas before he couldn't. It was also in the context of a very supportive atmosphere there at NIMH. But then the mother, put a lot of pressure on him to back down, and he didn't. So that the concept, I think, did come from facts of functioning. How does this individual function in the emotional unit? And that's where your clues are best for, and in this case, I'm talking about the vulnerability and the inability to adapt. Okay, we'll go out to Kansas City and Margaret, team.
I just had sort of 3 brief comments, Mike. One, I was thinking about how hard he tried to use his mind, his intellect, to compensate for his lack of social and relationship skills. And I don't think that's really uncommon, but it just really, even the delusions, I think, could be thought of that as a way to balance his ineptness on another level. And then just this, the second comment is just this difficult, just real struggle in adapting to wanting what you stated at the beginning, the all-loving, the attentive, the non-demanding, and to get his mind around the fact that that wasn't really out there, that there were expectations and troubles that were presented to him. And I don't know if that would be classified as not making corrections in the way, or correcting predictions, but he really, just that struggle. And then the third one, it got me thinking about just what is an effective form of treatment. Obviously the medical model and hospitalizations didn't cut it, and the family did, but then when the family can't do it anymore at home, what could be a societal level where that it could assist the family without imposing on it. So anyway, I was just thinking about a different idea when the families were exhausted.
Yeah, your first comment, when he was at, I think when he was at McLean and had really come out of the worst of it, a math colleague visited him and said, "John, how could you possibly believe you had this mission and you were going to be the prince of the world?" And Nash said, "Well, the idea came to me just like all my other ideas come to me. It just came to me. And that's the way I've always done math. The idea comes to me and I go with it." And this got me thinking, what does predispose somebody to manifest their problem as a disorder of mental process or the mind versus somewhere else in the body? And Bowen took a crack at that, but as you said, he was much more pleasured by creativity than he was by social relationships. And then for the longest time felt like, I guess, he just didn't need them. And then he got this stark realization, really, that he couldn't live without them. His life really depended on it. But I thought the other points you made were interesting as well. Well, I guess we're getting near 3 o'clock, so I hope I didn't overload you with too much detail. My we'll see how that works for the book. And I will see you next time, unless somebody else has anything they want to say here at the end. Kathy says, time to cut.